Could you give us an understanding of exactly what happened?
This was the abduction in 1989. I had no real interest in UFOs, although my identical twin brother Ronald and I had an encounter with a very strange sphere-shaped object with our maternal grandmother. But one part of that experience had me, as the abduction was taking place in the early hours of the morning, moving through solid matter. I mean, how ridiculous. Phillip Kinsella claims that he was abducted by Greys, and then there was an exploratory examination on a personal level that was terrifying.
Way of Will John.
My name is Phillip Kinsella, and I had some very unusual experiences, 4 of which changed and challenged my understanding of our genesis, of us being told that we're alone in this universe, and also the big question of life after death. So I spent many long years investigating, researching, and trying to formulate certain theories in order to create a working model as to what we may be dealing with, or if I use the word up against, that is more, I think, in terms of what we're speaking about here.
Okay. Well, to get, right into it, obviously, this is a subject that's become pretty mainstream over the course of a very few years in a way that obviously is insane to me, growing up in the 90s, where it was very taboo. Although we knew it was being discussed and talked about, it had to stay very fringe, and it's now squeezed its way to the forefront, which has made it better, I think, for everybody to have a more logical, rational discussion about what's going on, which has probably helped you dig through this as well, is because now we can actually discuss it without it being such a ridiculous fringe subject. So with that in mind, could you give us an understanding of exactly what happened, and then we'll go from there?
This was the abduction in 1989 that I had, and of course at that point I had no real interest in UFOs, although my identical twin brother Ronald and I had an encounter with a very strange sphere-shaped object with our maternal grandmother in Middlesex, England, when we were aged 13. And that challenged our understanding of reality, because if anyone said that it was a UFO, well, how can an object the size of a football, perfectly spherical and silver, be a UFO? And of course, years later, we kind of get the idea that this could possibly be what, pilots in World War II were reporting as Foo Fighters. But the onslaught of the experience I had in 1989, and we were living in a village called 𝗪𝗡𝗡 here in England, in a small cul-de-sac. And even to this day, I'm still trying to understand what happened, although the whole event is as clear as though it had happened yesterday. And most people will say, well, if you're abducted, and I use the quote there, by aliens, normally there is a secretion of memory, but I am very hard to hypnotize. And of course, I record all of the fine details of that experience. And I just have to point out here that you're right. The main emphasis of ufology has transformed throughout the years. And this is interesting because with my so-called abduction, and I say abduction because I couldn't tell you what it was, only that it fitted the classic patterns of what we know to be an alien abduction, was that one part of that experience had me, as the abduction was taking place in the early hours of the morning, although when the experience had finished, I had physical marks, which were quite relevant, and one possible implant within the right ear, or, they call it an implant. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I wanted to investigate this connection with ufology, where people say, well, it's a very physical experience, but there was a non-physical part attached to that. And this is where I molded a lot of my research into how this is possible. And of course, when you're dealing with ufology, it's not just contained within that subject matter. It also opens up other areas of what we are as humans, where we come from, the big question of life after death. And that was another area that fired up some years after the abduction. Now, the abduction itself was horrifying. And of course, you had to be careful because you have 2 departments within ufology. Those that love and light, absolutely understandable, and those that see it on a very negative level. And I'm not seeing it on a negative level. We have to look at both sides of the coin when we're exploring this subject, because we can't be biased and say, oh, it's all love and light. My understanding is I wanted to know what the Greys were. And yes, embarrassing to say, there were 3 reptilians within that abduction. And of course, years later, when I actually did find a publisher to publish my books, long before Amazon came along and all the rest of it, when I explained about the abduction in one of the chapters to my book, my publisher, John Day, is no longer sadly on this side of life, said we have to retract that because we cannot make any correlation between the reptilians and the Greys. And of course, within ufology, the law of ufology, it was all about the Greys. And so going back to what you were saying, Will, very, very interesting, because I know that you are top notch on all of these areas. You know, what I'm saying here is that ufology has transformed, interestingly. Back in the 40s and 50s, they were the flying discs. And then, of course, the 60s, we had the Space Brothers. And the phenomena seems to have changed chillingly as we progress as a species with our understanding of science and technology. And this is very interesting. So my real primary research was to have an understanding about what these beings were, where they came from, why they're here. And I can tell you I still don't have a, but we do have an idea, a spectrum. Now, to go into the abduction is very long-winded. And there was a very embarrassing part to that, where there was an exploratory examination. And of course, when I was 20 years of age, Will, at that time, and very, very naive. And I always assumed at that point that ufology and contact was on a very benign level of interaction. This was not evident where I was concerned. And I did suffer, not that I want any sympathy, but I was very open and very honest, and I was invited onto national media television to talk about the experience, and then found myself then at the onslaught of ridicule. And this then opened up another area of how the media cartel work, and also the higher structured systems. I mean, I'm not jumping the subject matters here, but it's important to address that we are dealing with a phenomena that the system that we serve tells us does not exist. And yet the acronym of which has changed from UFO to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. So for something that doesn't exist, I'm confused. So you've changed the acronym. Yeah. Then you get to the Pentagon. I mean, within your, great countries, I know you've moved around quite a lot, but the United States of America, supreme commanders of that country, there is a problem, I think, in terms of disclosure, because the public have been programmed, conscious dissidents. Oh no, the UFO is just fairy folklore. Life after death is just, just faith. Our genesis, our human genesis is linked with some kind of sacred text that it's good to have faith because that doesn't challenge the official system.
Right.
And the other part to a genesis through the Darwinian thought is ridiculous. And anyone that steps out of line, not only within UFO research, within life after death research or Genesis, is immediately quashed. And I've always wondered, why is this the case? What do they not want us to know? And going back to the UFO subject, a passion, the same with you, with all of these areas of the truth of what we hope we can find, what we're dealing with here, is that they know something. I'm not talking about the governments because they're mere puppets for those perhaps really running the show behind the scenes, the nameless, faceless bureaucrats. But there is definitely now a no conspiracy. There is definitely this design, this agenda to dumb down the masses, to play it down. And I think when we look at the UFO subject, it's going to be a problem because this will open up a can of worms, not just about, oh, we're not alone, or are we dealing with some type of interdimensional construct? God forbid, back in the 60s and 70s, the idea was never there. But the phenomena morphs and changes as we do. It's always one step ahead. And I think the system, disclosure, I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon, unless the phenomena presents itself on a worldwide level, is going to say to the public, oh, yes, I'm sorry, Will and Philip, and all you other wonderful people, we've lied to you. Actually, you've been right. UFOs do exist, but it's not quite how we've promoted it or molded it within the official capacity and within the media machine. And I think, the way that we're seeing this is very interesting because it's telling us, and I think a lot more people are waking up, it's telling us that we have been lied to. There is no conspiracy to be had. But the fascinating question is, what Are they? Where are they? And I always joke, Will, and say, if you could tell me what bar they're down, let's go down and have a drink with them all and talk about this, you know. So I think when we're dealing with the UFO phenomena, we have a large scale issue, a problem, because of the disinformation, misinformation, and structured belief systems, even within ufology, even with researchers and those that are very much interested within the subject matter. And I think belief is very sacred to the individual. And if that belief is challenged in any way, then you've got a problem. So we've got a lot on our plate when we're trying to deal with the Greys, one of the most famous entities within UFO lore. But just going back about the reptilians, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, how ridiculous. Phillip Kinsella claims that he was abducted by Greys, and then there was an exploratory examination on a personal level that was terrifying with reptilians. Okay, and now what are we seeing is, you know, this is back in 1989. The reptilians must not be mentioned, although they do combine with a great deal of many cultures within our human existence. So, yeah, so the experience in 1989 led me to really question what we are dealing with. Taking away the fanciful version, the romanticized version, the rawness of that is what interested me.
All right, if you enjoyed that clip, you can check out the full podcast by clicking right here. And if you want exclusive content, join our newsletter, become a badass member, thewayofwilljohn.com. The link is right down below.